10 historical doctors who turned to murder. Welcome back to Creepshow, where we delve into the dark and twisted corners of history. We trust doctors with our lives, but sometimes that trust can be deadly. Today, we'll be uncovering the shocking stories of 10 doctors throughout history who took a horrifying turn. From healers to killers. These are the true stories of doctors whose hunger for power, money, and, in some cases, sheer thrill, led them to commit unspeakable acts. Get ready, because you're about to meet the darkest side of the medical profession. Number 10. The Brighton Murder. In June 1866, Dr. Alfred William Warder and his wife, Helen, checked into the Bedford Hotel in the seaside town of Brighton. But what was supposed to be a getaway soon turned into a nightmare. Helen fell gravely ill shortly after their arrival, and her brother, Mr. Branwell, grew increasingly concerned. He called on a local physician, Dr. Richard Toffa, to examine her. Dr. Toffa was shocked by what he found. Warder had been treating Helen's pain with Fleming's tincture of aconite, a potent poison even in small doses. Toffa adjusted her prescription, but it's unclear if Warder followed these new instructions. Tragically, Helen passed away just days later. Both Mr. Branwell and Dr. Toffa suspected something sinister. They questioned the cause of her death, and, to their surprise, Dr. Warder readily agreed to a post-mortem exam. The results were damning. Helen had been poisoned. Newspapers quickly branded Dr. Warder guilty of willful murder. But before he could face trial, he took his own life, drinking prussic acid in his hotel room. The story didn't end there. Helen was Dr. Warder's third wife, and whispers soon emerged that his first two wives had also died under mysterious circumstances. It seems Helen might not have been his first victim after all. Just one of the chilling tales that reminds us how the line between healer and killer can be terrifyingly thin. Number 9. The Playboy Poisoner. In 1915, Hannah Peck couldn't have been happier when her daughter Clara caught the eye of Arthur Warren Waite. He was young, charming, and a successful dentist in New York City, a perfect match for her daughter. After a quick courtship, Clara and Arthur were married and moved to Manhattan, where Waite seemed like the ideal son-in-law. But behind the facade, he harbored dark intentions. Arthur had no plans of living the quiet, married life. Instead, he dreamed of a lavish lifestyle, one fueled by Clara's inheritance. Her father, John Peck, had amassed a fortune through his successful drugstore business in Grand Rapids, Michigan. With millions at stake, Waite began plotting his next move. In January 1916, he invited his mother-in-law, Hannah, to visit. Shortly after her arrival, she fell mysteriously ill and died within days. Arthur wasted no time and invited John Peck to stay with them in March. The outcome was disturbingly similar. John Peck, too, fell ill and died in just a few days. Arthur might have gotten away with it, but a strange telegram was sent to the Peck's son, Percy, reading, "Suspicions arouse demand autopsy." While Hannah had already been cremated, Percy managed to recover his father's body for examination, despite Waite's protests. The autopsy revealed traces of arsenic and chloroform, and soon after, Arthur was arrested. He admitted he had married Clara solely for the inheritance, and chillingly, he planned to make her his next victim. The telegram that saved Clara's life came from Elizabeth Hardwick. Hardwick had grown suspicious after seeing Arthur dine with his mistress, and learning that he had denied his own employer, her father, a doctor, access to John Peck's body. Thanks to her, the Pecks uncovered the truth about the man they had welcomed into their family. Number 8. The Homeopathic Killer. In mid-19th century Paris, Edmond de la Pommerais built a successful career as a homeopath. But his love of gambling constantly left him in financial ruin. Desperate for a quick solution, he saw marriage as a way to solve his money problems. In 1861, he wed Mademoiselle d'Abizy, whose family was well off. Unfortunately for Pommerais, her mother controlled the family's finances and openly disapproved of their union. It didn't take long for him to take action. Only a few months after the wedding, Madame de Bezy visited her daughter's home for dinner. That night, she fell violently ill, and a few days later, she was dead. Pommerais, acting as her physician, declared that she had died from Asiatic cholera. With her out of the way, he could finally access the inheritance. But the relief was short-lived. By 1863, Pommerais was deep in debt once again. This time, he concocted a plan with his mistress, Séraphine de Pau. They devised an insurance scam where she would take out a policy with him as the beneficiary. Pommerais would then diagnose her with a terminal illness so she could receive an annuity from the insurer. But greed got the better of him. Instead of faking her illness, he decided to kill her and claim the entire payout. The plan nearly worked, but Séraphine's sister, aware of their scheme, alerted the police. Authorities enlisted the help of forensic expert Ambroise Tardieu, who tested Séraphine's vomit. Tardieu discovered traces of digitalis, a potent poison. Pommerais' double-dealing and greed had finally caught up with him. In 1864, he faced justice and the guillotine for his crimes. This homeopathic killer reminds us that even those we trust to heal can sometimes be the ones dealing death. Number 7. Murder by mail. In the late 1800s, Josephine Barnaby was a prominent heiress in Providence, Rhode Island, with a considerable fortune. She entrusted her affairs to her trusted confidant, Dr. Thomas Thatcher Graves. As her physician, Graves gained her trust and eventually secured power of attorney, which allowed him to name himself as the beneficiary of her estate. But Dr. Graves wasn't willing to wait for Barnaby's natural death. During a trip to visit a friend in Denver, she received an unexpected gift, a bottle of whiskey from an anonymous admirer. Unbeknownst to her, the whiskey had been laced with arsenic. Both Mrs. Barnaby and her friend sampled the drink, fell ill, and ultimately died from the poisoning. Graves thought he had meticulously covered his tracks. He'd purchased the bottle in Boston and even convinced a man at the train station, Joseph Breslin, to write a note to Barnaby, ensuring she wouldn't recognize his handwriting. So, when Graves was summoned to Denver to testify in what he thought was a case against another man, he went without suspicion. But it was all a setup. The famous Pinkerton detective James McParland had devised a clever trap to lure Graves to Denver, where he was promptly arrested. At trial, Breslin testified against him, sealing Graves's fate. Found guilty of murder, Graves ended his life in his cell before the sentence could be carried out. Murder by mail remains one of the most chilling cases, proving that greed can drive some to unspeakable lengths, even turning a trusted confidant into a cold-blooded killer. Number 6. A deadly love triangle. In 1959, Dr. Bernard Finch had a successful career as a surgeon and seemed to have it all. But his life took a dark turn when he met 18-year-old Carol Tregoff, a new receptionist at his Los Angeles Medical Center. Their affair quickly ignited, and soon they were talking about marriage. There was just one problem. Both were already married. Carol was willing to leave her husband, but for Dr. Finch, divorce was more complicated. His wife, Barbara, would be entitled to half of his fortune, and if she proved adultery, she could claim even more. Driven by greed, Finch decided the only way out was murder. On the fateful day, Finch waited for Barbara to come home, confronted her in the driveway, and after a brief struggle, shot her at point-blank range. Following the attack, he and Tregoff fled Los Angeles separately, reuniting in Las Vegas. But authorities were already onto them, and both were arrested and charged with murder. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward, and forensic evidence painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. Finch, however, managed to cast doubt on his role, claiming Barbara had grabbed the gun and it had gone off accidentally during a struggle. His arguments led to 2 mistrials due to deadlocked juries, but in 1961, justice finally caught up with them. A 3rd trial sentenced both Finch and Tregoff to life in prison. Despite the conviction, they each served less than a decade. Finch 10 years and Tregoff 8, before being paroled. This tragic love triangle ended not in romance, but in betrayal, prison sentences, and a reminder of how far some are willing to go to get what they want. Number 5. The Richmond Poisoner. On the surface, the case of Isabella Smethurst's death seemed straightforward, a clear case of murder by her husband, Dr. Thomas Smethurst, dubbed the Richmond Poisoner. But in a surprising turn of events, forensic errors, accusations of a biased trial, and public outcry led to his acquittal. And in a strange twist, Smethurst even managed to claim the inheritance he was accused of murdering for. In the summer of 1858, the Smethursts moved to Richmond, London. Shortly after, Isabella fell ill, showing symptoms that pointed toward poisoning. Her doctor became suspicious and sent a sample of her vomit to Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, a renowned forensic expert of the time. Taylor found traces of arsenic, and Dr. Smethurst was promptly arrested. Yet, as he hadn't been convicted, he convinced the magistrate to let him stay by his wife's side. Tragically, she passed away the next day. It soon emerged that Thomas and Isabella weren't legally married. In fact, they were in a bigamous relationship. But that didn't stop Isabella from leaving her entire estate to him in a will signed with her maiden name, Isabella Banks Spinster. Dr. Taylor even claimed to have found arsenic in one of Smethurst's bottles, mixed with another chemical to make it harder to detect. The case looked solid, but it wasn't long before cracks appeared. Dr. Taylor's tests, though respected, were flawed. The arsenic supposedly found in Smethurst's bottle was traced back to contamination from the copper gauze Taylor had used. Additionally, the presiding judge, Sir Frederick Pollock, was accused of trying to sway the jury against Smethurst. The initial guilty verdict was eventually overturned due to public pressure, and he received a full pardon from the Home Secretary. Despite the pardon, Dr. Smethurst was still sentenced to 1 year in prison for bigamy. He may have escaped the charge of murder, but the Richmond Poisoner left behind a legacy of controversy and questions about the power of public opinion in a court of law. Number 4. Doctor by day, robber by night. In 18th century London, Dr. Levi Weil was known as a skilled physician with a seemingly respectable practice. But his life took a darker turn, one that shocked the public. Weil led a gang of criminals responsible for robbery and murder. Known for his superior education, with a medical degree from Leiden University, it was almost unthinkable that he would lead such a double life. Weil's gang was composed mainly of German and Dutch Jews whom he lured to London, promising easy scores. Their final heist took place in late 1771, targeting the farmhouse of a widow, Mrs. Hutchings, in Chelsea. Late at night, the gang forced their way in, tied up Mrs. Hutchings and her 2 female servants, and proceeded to ransack the house. But 2 farmhands, John Slow and William Stone, were asleep in another part of the property. They were brutally attacked when the gang discovered them. Slow was shot dead, while Stone suffered a severe blow from Weil himself. Although Stone managed to escape through a window, he died the following day from his injuries. Initially, it looked like the gang would get away with the crime. But soon, one of the members turned on his accomplices in exchange for immunity and a reward, and the authorities closed in. The public was stunned to learn that the gang's ringleader was not only a doctor, but a well-educated one. In the end, 6 men stood trial. Due to insufficient evidence, 2 were released, but Weil and 3 others were convicted and hanged. Dr. Levi Weil's story is a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving, And sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide in plain sight. Number 3. Murderer or unlucky. Dr. Pierre Bougrat had a reputation as a war hero, receiving both the Military Cross and the Legion of Honor during World War I. After the war, he established a medical practice in Marseille, known for his occasional generosity, offering free treatment to the less fortunate. But Bougrat also had a weakness. He loved living lavishly, spending freely, and indulging in expensive tastes, particularly when it came to women. This lifestyle often left him strapped for cash. In 1925, Bougrat was treating a former comrade, Jacques Rumebe, who had come to his office with a satchel of money. Rumebe was a debt collector, and Bougrat was administering salvarsan, a common treatment for syphilis at the time. Rumebe was last seen alive in that office, and for a while, people assumed he had taken off with the money. The truth came to light months later when Bougrat was arrested for check forgery. During a search of his office, police found a hidden cupboard, cleverly disguised behind tapestry. Inside was the decomposing body of Rumebe. The gruesome discovery led most to believe that Bougrat had murdered his patient for the cash. Despite the evidence, Bougrat maintained his innocence. He insisted that Rumebe had lost the money at a brothel, became overwhelmed with shame, and took his own life. In a panic, fearing that no one would believe him, Bougrat hid the body. But the authorities didn't buy his story. Dr. Bougrat was convicted and sentenced to a penal colony in French Guiana, where he lived out the rest of his days. Whether a desperate act or a brutal crime, the story of Dr. Pierre Bougrat serves as a dark reminder of the thin line between desperation and murder. Number 2. The Irish Bluebeard. Dr. Robert George Clements was a respected figure in Belfast society, a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and a successful practitioner. But when his wife, Amy Burnett Clements, a wealthy heiress, died suddenly in 1947, it wasn't long before people began to whisper. Amy was the fourth of Clements's wives to die under mysterious circumstances, and it seemed like a dark pattern was beginning to emerge. Each of Dr. Clements's wives had a few things in common. They all left their wealth to him. They were cremated shortly after their deaths, and Clements had an influence over the cause of death on each certificate. With Amy, he strongly suggested that his colleague label the cause of death as myeloid leukemia. Though the colleague hesitated, he reluctantly agreed. But 4 suspicious deaths were too many, and the police were finally compelled to investigate. As the investigation continued, Dr. Clements's plan to cremate Amy was interrupted. This time, a second post-mortem was conducted, and it revealed the true cause of her death: morphine poisoning. The authorities now had a case of murder on their hands, and the once-respected doctor was facing serious charges. However, Dr. Clements never made it to trial. He was later found dead in his lab, having ingested over 300 times the lethal dose of cyanide. In a suicide note, he wrote that he could no longer endure the accusations and public shame. Known as the Irish Bluebeard, his story is a chilling reminder that some of the darkest secrets can hide behind a respectable title. Number 1. The Lambeth Poisoner. Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, known to many as the Lambeth Poisoner, left a chilling mark on 3 countries with a deadly combination of medical knowledge and sinister intent. Some believe he might have even been Jack the Ripper himself. His targeting of prostitutes, combined with his medical background, fueled the theory. And as the hangman's noose tightened around his neck, Cream reportedly muttered, "I am Jack," before his words were cut short. Regardless of any connection to the Ripper, Dr. Cream forged his own dark path. Born in Scotland and raised in Canada, Cream established his medical practice in Ontario. In 1879, his patient and alleged mistress, Kate Gardner, was found dead in an alley from chloroform poisoning. Suspicions mounted, but Cream managed to avoid arrest by fleeing to the United States, where he set up a back-alley abortion practice in Chicago. Rumors swirled around his involvement in the deaths of several prostitutes during this time. While some may have died from the inherent risks of illegal abortions, others, like Daniel Stott, were certainly victims of his deadly hand. Cream supplied Stott, an epilepsy patient, with medicine, all while carrying on an affair with his wife. When Stott became a problem, Cream poisoned him with strychnine and tried to blame the pharmacist. His attempt to frame another backfired, leading to his arrest and conviction. After serving time, Cream moved to London's Lambeth district, where he escalated his murderous activities, poisoning 4 women for sheer pleasure. But his arrogance betrayed him. Cream couldn't resist sending letters to the police, attempting to implicate others in his crimes. He even gave a U.S. policeman a detailed tour of the murder scenes, raising immediate suspicions. The officer reported him to Scotland Yard, and soon after, Cream was arrested. From Victorian-era poisonings to deadly love triangles, these doctors remind us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the shadows. They wear white coats. Thanks for joining us on this dark journey through history's most sinister doctors. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Creepshow for more chilling tales, and hit the bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Until next time, remember, the hands that heal can also harm.